Indonesia adalah salah satu negara anggota Perserikatan Bangsa atau PBB yang mengimplementasikan Tujuan Pembangunan Berkelanjutan atau SDGs yang ditetapkan sebagai agenda pembangunan global hingga tahun 2030. Nah, SDGs atau Sustainable Development Goals itu merupakan pembangunan berkelanjutan yang terdiri dari 17 tujuan dan 169 target. Di antaranya adalah pengentasan kemiskinan, meniadakan kelaparan dan kesetaraan gender. Nah, bagaimana strategi PBB dalam menjalankan berbagai misi melalui perwakilannya di sini di Indonesia dan apa-apa saja kendala yang dihadapi oleh negara berkembang seperti Indonesia untuk mencapai tujuan SDGs-nya. Kita akan bahas kali ini dalam Insight bersama saya Desi Anwar.
Hingga tahun 2017, proses pelaksanaan SDGs atau TPB di Indonesia masih dalam tahap persiapan dan penyusunan. Sebagai bentuk komitmen pemerintah atas program ini, Indonesia atas arahan Presiden Joko Widodo dalam sidang kabinet pada 23 Desember tahun 2015 segera melaksanakan berbagai persiapan untuk implementasi SDGs. Salah satunya melalui pembuatan peraturan Presiden tentang pelaksanaan Tujuan Pembangunan Berkelanjutan. Selain itu, pemerintah juga membentuk Tim Koordinasi Nasional Tujuan Pembangunan Berkelanjutan atau TPB yang diketuai langsung oleh Presiden. Bappenas pun ditunjuk sebagai lembaga yang mengawal langsung pelaksanaan TPB di Indonesia.
Oleh karena itu, kita untuk mengimplementasikan susun menyiapkan yang disebut dengan Perpres. Perpres ini isinya adalah penugasan Presiden ya kepada para menteri dan para gubernur untuk menyiapkan baik itu roadmap sampai dengan 2030, menyiapkan rencana aksi nasional 5 tahunan, menyiapkan rencana aksi daerah 5 tahunan bagi gubernur.
Dari 17 poin tujuan yang disepakati dalam Sustainable Development Goals ini, di tahun 2017 Indonesia berfokus pada 7 poin diantaranya. 7 fokus tujuan tersebut adalah mengakhiri kemiskinan tanpa kelaparan, kehidupan sehat dan sejahtera, kesetaraan gender, serta tujuan nomor 9 di bidang industri, inovasi dan infrastruktur, nomor 14 mengenai ekosistem kelautan, dan poin 17 tentang kemitraan untuk mencapai tujuan. Bappenas yang menjadi bagian dari tim pelaksana menemukan kendala khususnya pada perolehan data kependudukan.
Ini adalah salah satunya yang menjadi sangat penting dan menjadi kendala. Masalah data. Data tidak hanya data global loh. Jumlah penduduk sekian. Ada laki perempuan berapa, berdasarkan umur berapa, berdasarkan income berapa. Itu yang urban sama rural. Nah, jadi yang menjadi sangat menjadi tantangan adalah masalah data.
Komitmen pemerintah dalam upaya mencapai 17 tujuan dengan 169 target pencapaian dalam SDGs atau Tujuan Pembangunan Berkelanjutan bukan satu-satunya yang dibutuhkan. Stakeholder lain di luar pemerintahan juga dibutuhkan untuk mewujudkan program ini. Para stakeholder ini adalah filantropi atau pelaku usaha, akademisi, dan organisasi masyarakat sipil. Kerjasama ini dibutuhkan untuk mewujudkan Indonesia yang lebih baik pada akhir masa SDGs di 2030 nanti. Manggar Fatani, Jakarta.
Ya, PBB menempatkan sejumlah kantor perwakilannya di kawasan Asia dan Pasifik termasuk Indonesia. Nah, di Indonesia perwakilan PBB ini menjalankan misi di berbagai bidang seperti kesehatan, pembangunan hingga lingkungan. Nah, sejauh mana pencapaian sejumlah perwakilan PBB di Indonesia dan juga bagaimana strategi PBB dalam menjalankan misinya di Indonesia? Untuk membahasnya kita akan berbincang dengan Douglas Broderick, Kepala Perwakilan PBB di Indonesia, sekaligus juga Kepala Perwakilan UNDP di Indonesia. Langsung saja kita sapa. Halo Douglas.
Hi Desi, good to be here and thank you.
Ya, nah Douglas ini seperti kita ketahui sudah berada di Indonesia lebih dari 4 tahun dan ini merupakan bukan perjalanan yang pertama kali ke Indonesia. Douglas, I'm just saying you have been in Indonesia for the last 4 years. You are leaving us soon, and yet at the same time, Indonesia is not a stranger to you. You have been to Indonesia before. You're familiar with Indonesia, and then now, and then for the last 4 years, you've been representing both the UN and the UNDP. Just recap, how do you feel about your stay here, leaving Indonesia? What are your regrets? What are your takeaways?
I've been very happy with my term in Indonesia, and I'm very optimistic about Indonesia. I think we're looking at the economy moving from 1 to 2 trillion. We know that Indonesia is an emerging democracy. So there's work that all of us have to do on the emerging democracy. We also know that there's very big challenges in terms of the quality of life indicators, the sustainable development goals, especially around health and around education. There are some other things, like, for instance, in climate change, what Indonesia faces. But little did I know that me coming to Indonesia in 1982, that I would return here 3 decades later and lead the UN, which I'm happy to do. And it's extraordinary. When I first came to Indonesia in '82, it was poor.
It's a different world as well.
It was another world.
We were not a democracy then.
Not a democracy. Bali was a fantasy land, and over 50% of the people were poor. In fact, I remember seeing somebody on a bus in Sumatra begging for money who had elephantitis and coming through the corridor of the bus. Now in Indonesia, poverty alleviation, there's less than 12% poverty in Indonesia, down from 50%. There is health care.
Yeah.
There is education for the young. There's a very vibrant democracy. At past, it was very different. It was a military dictatorship. It had a different element. And now, as we saw last week, you have voting, you have free and fair elections, and you have a democracy that's emerging and moving stronger and stronger, with an active civil society, with an active media, with an active checks and balances.
Yes, and hopefully our human development also keeps improving. Now, the last 4 years that you have been here, Douglas, and bearing in mind your memories of Indonesia back in the 80s, completely different. I mean, what did you see as sort of the priorities, given that, you know, a lot has changed in Indonesian society, and also with just the people in general when it comes to things like health, education, and welfare?
I think that the first priority that everybody wants to look at is obviously governance. And we have to get the building blocks of governance together. Free and fair elections helps that.
Yeah.
But also there's other ways in terms of getting better governance into the districts, into the 501 districts and the 34 provinces, in tackling corruption, in terms of making sure that government knows the priorities for the people. The second thing that's extraordinarily very important for Indonesia moving ahead for the future is health. And right now, Indonesia is spending about $100 per person per year.
We have increased
on
the
health,
budget on health,
which is increasing. And we're looking at 2019, the universal health care implementation in Indonesia. But that's going to be a big challenge moving ahead in the future, especially financing that and getting everybody to have access to health. And the third thing that is very, very important is the education. 7.5 years of average schooling is not going to cut it in the competitive world, especially the ASEAN world. If you look around the region and see some of the achievements of some of the other countries vis-a-vis for their schooling and their educational systems.
Yeah, especially when in Indonesia, in our PISA test, we always sort of scored the highest from the bottom. You know,
just about. I know it wasn't at the bottom, but it could be improved tremendously, and we all know that. And obviously, the universities and the research institutions need to have more of a linkage into the private sector and the economy. We need to look at some sort of vocational training arrangements to gauge that. And we also have to work very hard in keeping kids at school. Enrolling kids in school is fine, but keeping them in school and making sure that they stay in school. and at least get 9 years of education as a goal under the Sustainable Development Goals.
And it should be implementable, especially when the government is now focusing 20% of its budget towards education. There has to be results coming from that kind of focus. Let me just go back to the first part of your priority here, which is good governance. And you came here 4 years ago, and then we had the election. Now we have President Joko Widodo as president. Just give us a sense of where Indonesia is moving when it comes to corruption, eradicating corruption, and creating a good, clean governance. Because this is something that we all, I mean, one of the whole reasons why we want to have a democracy is because we want to have more transparency, more accountability, and of course, much more effective government. How do you think that has been implementable?
What I do commend the government is that elections have been held. I was here for the 2014 election, which was obviously President Jokowi being the first, let's say, populist president elected, not from the formula of the past presidential elections, was something significant for all of us. And the way that he has reached out and engaged with the people and put the people's interests first has been very good, and a very, very good formula for continued governance in the future. Corruption is a very difficult thing to tackle. The whole world is tackling it. Many countries have the same challenges and problems. It's something that has to be chipped at. You have to chip very slowly at it and chip away at the sides, chip away at, for instance, in the forestry sector, you need to have environmental rules not only passed, but also enforced and implemented and all. And that kind of enforcement and implementation needs to be strengthened, both at the local level, both at the regional level, and we all need to work together on that in terms of different projects, different programs to support local institutions to build capacity.
But what have been the main challenges that you face, particularly because you partner obviously with local governments and you have programs to ensure that good governance is a priority? What have been sort of the main challenges? And in the last 4 years of you being in Indonesia, do you actually see significant improvement that make you say, okay, tick, at least this is going in the right direction?
One thing, the two things that we do see, we see tremendous interest in terms of young people being engaged in government and young people taking on positions. Like the other day, the Jambi governor I was with, and he was a 38-year-old dynamic person. We see somebody like him being engaged and being open, being transparent, being very productive, being concerned about putting the people's interests first, working in the system. So we see champions. We see people that want to be stars and are able to lead in terms of that way in the future. And that generation of leaders, more and more, will be coming up through the system. The second thing that we see is the interest in terms of government officials, especially the younger one, for better education, better training. And those are the kind of things that UNDP has done in terms of providing, it could be education or training in gender equality, or education in terms of law enforcement, or education in terms of legislative procedures.
We'll take a little break, Douglas.
Yeah.
We will continue our conversation. Setelah yang berikut ini kita akan lanjutkan pembahasan mengenai pencapaian target SDGs di Indonesia. Tetaplah bersama Insight. Ya, kembali dalam Insight. Indonesia memiliki sejumlah potensi untuk mencapai tujuan pembangunan berkelanjutan atau SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals. Namun di balik berbagai potensi yang dimiliki, Indonesia juga memiliki sejumlah masalah yang harus diatasi, misalnya kemiskinan serta malnutrisi. Nah, Bagaimana pencapaian SDGs di Indonesia dan apa saja tantangan yang dihadapi untuk mencapai tujuan ini. Kita lanjutkan pembahasannya. Saya masih ditemani oleh Douglas Broderick, Kepala PBB di Indonesia sekaligus Kepala Perwakilan UNDP di Indonesia. Douglas, we touched a little bit on SDGs. Actually, this is a very important part of the discussion because Indonesia, together with all the countries under the UN, we have committed for the next 15 years to implement SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals. And we have, if you look behind us, we have 17 goals. There's a lot of goals. But this is actually a continuation of what we had before that, which is the Millennium Development Goals. And there's still a lot of homework that we see Indonesia had not achieved during when we implemented the Millennium Development Goals. And you mentioned earlier that one of your priorities is on health. Now here we still see goals directly related to health, to good health and well-being, and of course all the other parts has some kind of link also with health, such as poverty and zero hunger. That's very much tied and linked to health. Last 4 years, Douglas, how have you been doing when it comes to working together with the UN and the UNDP tackling health issues?
First of all, what I want to say on the Sustainable Development Goals is that Indonesia was part of the formation of this, and the previous administration inputted into this very, very much, and we have these 17 goals because of Indonesia's contribution and investment. The whole world is behind. There's only a very few select countries that have been able to achieve completely their SDG goals. For instance, in Indonesia, in terms of the health, we're very concerned about the maternal mortality rate, which is a gender issue and also a health issue. The rate is over 300 per 100,000 births in Indonesia, and women dying giving life is not good.
And it's part of the MDG goals that we did not.
And it's part of the MDG goals that
achieve.
need to be carried over to the Sustainable Development Goals. The other thing that we're obviously very concerned about is the HIV rate. And right now, Indonesia has about 650,000 carriers of HIV. And we're concerned about that rate increasing, making sure we get testing, counseling, and treatment for all the HIV carriers in Indonesia. And, that does remain a significant challenge. We have, for instance, in health, 37% stunting.
Particularly in the eastern part of Indonesia.
Particularly in the eastern part of Indonesia for the under 5-year-old children and population, which is something that it is happening in the Philippines, it is happening in Cambodia, but it's something that government and all of us as partners need to address and do something about in the future. We also have a concern about Indonesia in terms of open defecation, which means, let's say, adequate water and sanitation facilities. And there's 60 to 80 million Indonesians that don't have adequate water and sanitation facilities, and that causes all sorts of diarrhea and other diseases which affects the population.
So we've still got a lot of homework to do.
So there is a lot of homework for us to do. There have been achievements that we've accomplished. Obviously, there are things in terms of the infant mortality rate. There's the malaria rate, but at the end of the day, there's these big challenges that need to be tackled over the next 15 years to 2030 to make sure we leave no one behind.
And could you perhaps share with us some of the projects that the UN and particularly the UNDP have implemented together with the government, particularly the local government, and where particularly they can be replicated and also to reflect that work is being done in this area. There is success and there is optimism for the future.
There's tremendous optimism that we have, for instance, on the maternal mortality rate. And UNDP has worked with a framework, a policy, and to accelerate government policy, especially at the regional level. Like, for instance, in Eastern Java, we've come up with making sure that we have local governments focus on that. especially rural women in East Java. We make sure that the referral hospitals, the ambulance system, the care for difficult pregnancies, which is 15% in Indonesia, the screening of women on difficult pregnancies every 3 months, the infrastructure, the emergency obstetrics kit, and the referral to emergency care is in place. And it's a project that we've worked on. We're very proud of working on it. And in some of the districts, it has reduced the maternal mortality rate. And we look forward to that as a prototype to be expanded throughout Indonesia and tackle the maternal mortality rate
And you
in
see
the future.
capacity being built.
And we see capacity
local...
being built. We see awareness being built. We see midwives responding to this. We see local health centers responding to this. We see better referrals, and we see more emphasis, especially policymakers who are the ones paying for this and providing budget, and say, hey, wait a minute, this is a problem. We need to tackle this together. So UNDP has been working very, very actively, especially addressing on that.
Yeah, and also the fact that Jokowi's government, they have this sort of nawacita in the policies that hopefully aligned with our commitment with SDGs, like you mentioned. Indonesia is one of the, highly motivated when it comes to putting together the targets for the SDGs. Yeah. Do you see that kind of policy making at the local level, alignment between the SDGs and what the government actually wants Indonesia to achieve, or are there still sort of gaps that need to be filled? It's
pretty amazing in a way that we have some of the local municipalities, local governments and cities come into, obviously, the UN and come into the different agencies and want more information, want to develop their own SDG plans, want to develop their own action plans, which is wonderful for us because obviously we've done a good job in terms of communications and awareness, which we have to do more of on the SDGs. And the other thing eventually we would love to see is that a plan of the SDGs, all of the 17 goals, percolate down to every single one of the 77,000 villages in Indonesia. And that each village, each district, each province has their own SDG plan in terms of customized for their needs to respond to what is most important to their people. Okay. And that's something that we would want to work on more and continue to work on in terms of that localization, in terms of that socialization, and that communications of the SDG
and the capacity
plan
building, getting everybody on the same page. Okay, we'll take another little break, but we've still got a few areas to cover, Douglas, so bear with me. Setelah informasi berikut ini, kita akan lanjutkan pembahasan tentang misi dan juga visi PBB di Indonesia. Tetaplah bersama Insight. Iya, kita lanjutkan Insight dan pembahasan mengenai visi dan misi PBB di Indonesia. Saya ditemani oleh Douglas Broderick, Kepala PBB di Indonesia dan juga Kepala Perwakilan UNDP di Indonesia. Douglas Broderick akan tidak lama lagi meninggalkan kita ya setelah 4 tahun bertugas di Indonesia. 4 years, a long time, and it's not enough time to get things done. And we mentioned some of the focus that the UN and the UNDP have done in Indonesia, such as, for example, on health, on good governance, but we've still got lots in terms of getting our SDG goals on track. Education, you mentioned, is one of the priorities. And of course, when we talk about moving forward to creating a much better life in Indonesia and also in the world, climate issues, obviously, very much an important part of what we need to focus on, particularly the Paris Agreement, which might be in trouble if, for example, one president of the United States decide that he's no longer interested in taking part of it. Tell us, what are your thoughts on getting some of these things on track here, particularly in Indonesia?
I think it's been very positive. Obviously, Indonesia has a very high deforestation rate. We know that, the 1.5%. Government has had commitments to the climate change and environment. It's a very key portfolio that we've been working on as hard as possible. For instance, we've been working on trying to reduce the haze, identifying hotspots with some of the big data and video screening, media screening of those areas to identify that to help government.
And are they using that? Are they using big data? Are they using the technology?
There's a haze gazer technology that UNDP has started with our innovation lab, Global Pulse, and that's been identifying hotspots for the government in terms of climate change and environment. We've also been working on financing for climate change and environment, ways to get alternative funding for smallholder farmers and for poor people, addressing some of the climate change issues. Obviously, we're well aware that up to 60% of the Indonesian people in some shape or form will be affected by climate change in the future, especially children and women. So it is a big part of our portfolio. The other part of the climate change and environment portfolio is the enforcement issue.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it's crucial,
and that's
particularly when it comes to dealing with companies that basically are guilty of burning our forests, and yet they are not properly punished for it.
And that's a critical issue in terms of the courts, in terms of the training of the police, in terms of making sure the rules and regulations are very, very clear, but more so in terms of the enforcement. And, you know, that's a long-term issue. We've had challenges in the Congo, we've had challenges in Brazil, and we have challenges in Indonesia on that. The other aspect of the climate change is our support to the peatland agency. There's a new peatland agency which is about a year old.
That's right. This came out from the Paris Agreement as part of Indonesia's commitment to reduce our carbon emission by a certain target, 27%,
Correct.
Something by 2030.
And that's been a very important support, with us supporting that with the Ministry of Environment.
But is that being taken up by the local governments? Because at the end of the day, it's the local governments that will have to
At the end of the day,
implement
that's the eventual plan, that basically the
Mm-hmm.
peatland agency is started. It basically runs through the central part of the government, and we like to make sure that in terms of digging canals or identifying hotspots or working for alternative livelihoods for some of the people, rather than obviously entering in directly into palm oil, would be available for them to do and address some of their problems at the local level. So ideally, we'd like to have that kind of portfolio of projects and interventions, different interventions, to give people alternative ways and to help governments in terms of their enforcement
and to make sure that
and
there's
implementation.
no more burning when it comes to
and
peatland,
that there's no more burning.
because that is the main cause of the haze in Indonesia, particularly in the dry season. Now, the other one is life below water, and as you well know, and this Nawacita includes making Indonesia the hub for the maritime, whether it's, you know, in terms of the commercial aspect of it, but at the same time, maximizing the potentials that we have in our oceans. Now, what kind of things are you helping when it comes to not so much exploiting, but ensuring sustainability when it comes to maximizing our ocean potentials?
Obviously, goal number 14 on the oceans is very, very important for Indonesia, especially moving in the future. The one thing that I personally have been very concerned about is marine debris. Indonesia is the second largest marine debris producer in the world. And
all that plastic. And
I
all
would
that.
like at the end of the day to emphasize that oceans are for fish, not plastic. And I think that we have a long road ahead of us in terms of education and in terms of alternative materials to replace plastic, for us to tackle that problem. And indeed, it's a very, very big problem. And it's entering our food supply chain with our fish. Microparticles of plastic are not very good for fish. fish eat that, and then
And
that
then we eat
enters
fish.
us.
And also not just in the ocean, but also clogs up our rivers and also our
Clogs up and pollutes our
soils,
rivers, and it's a big, big, big challenge. The other issue that we want to make sure in terms of encouraging the value chain, like Indonesia needs to increase the investment in terms of fisheries, increase the catch. I know that the Ministry of Fisheries has gone after and make sure that there's more Indonesian fishing and that the foreign fishing vessels are not poaching or coming in with the illegal, unlicensed fishing.
And sinking illegal boats and ships.
And at the end of the day, that's very important in terms of getting the pieces of that together so that Indonesia has built or will continue to build their fishing industry, but also capture some of that in the value chain and not have fish being exported to other places in the world.
Let's take another little break, Douglas, but we will get back to you. There's still things to be discussed. One of the things, of course, is the role of the United Nations that in this incredibly dynamic, transformative and changing world, lots of challenges ahead, and I would like to hear your thoughts about it. Setelah yang berikut ini, kita akan lanjutkan pembahasan mengenai visi misi PBB dan juga bagaimana dampaknya terhadap Indonesia. Sesaat lagi. Ya, Anda menyaksikan Insight. Kita lanjutkan diskusi mengenai keberadaan PBB dan UNDP di Indonesia. Saya ditemani oleh Douglas Broderick, Kepala PBB di Indonesia sekaligus Kepala Perwakilan UNDP di Indonesia. Ini sudah hari-hari terakhir bagi Douglas Broderick dan ini juga merupakan semacam perpisahan ya. Farewell to Douglas Broderick setelah sudah lebih dari 4 tahun di Indonesia. Tadi kita sudah berdiskusi bagaimana PBB dan juga UNDP bekerja sama dengan Indonesia dan program-programnya apa-apa saja. Tentu saja masih banyak, tidak bisa kita cover ya. We cannot cover everything in this discussion, but let's talk just very quickly about, the first time you were in Indonesia, 1980s, and then you, of course, followed the democratization of Indonesia, and then representing the UN and the UNDP for the last 4 years. In terms of the human development, the ways that Indonesians have changed, whether it's through better education, better health, and democratization, what can you say about where we are at the moment, particularly on issues such as, for example, gender equality, opportunities for good education, and that aspect that actually improve the Indonesian person, so to speak?
I think Indonesia has made a lot of progress, but gender equality is something that all of us have to do more work on. Like, for instance, 1/3 of the women in Indonesia have been subject to violence and sexual abuse. We know that less than 20% of the women in Indonesia, in terms of being in positions of power and parliament, and we all have to work to increase that together. We also talk about most women in the labor force are in the informal sector. We also talk about the lower educational levels for women. So there's a lot of work that we have to do all together to get those pieces of gender equality together, and not only get it together, but to promote it and make, let's say, men aware of this and make sure that we do it also through the educational curriculum.
How? Can you point some of the projects that UN is actually focusing on?
For instance, what we've done is we've had a process where we've had education for parliamentarian positions, and we've had education for women in parliament positions in terms of increasing women, giving them confidence, giving them ways to participate, to run for election, how to run for election, how to be in terms of good governing legislatures. We've also given a reach out to lawmakers, for instance, on the SDGs. not many people know completely the SDGs, and it's our responsibility to the policymakers, to the lawmakers, to the women who are in power, the less than 20% in positions, to explain to them in a very simple way, not in UN language, what the Sustainable Development Goals are and how they can use that to better governance and better help their people going down the road, with this as a glue for good governance to help serve people better.
Yes, well, ideally there's supposed to be a quota, on women participation in Parliament, although whether that was taken seriously in terms of a quality as opposed to just getting the numbers of the women, that is still very much an issue. Now, the other thing is like keeping women also, backwards, so to speak, is poverty, basically poverty, and especially things like early marriage and also lack of access to education for girls. What needs to be done, and what have you been doing about it?
Early marriage is a tremendous challenge. 1 out of 6 girls in Indonesia are affected by early marriage under the age of 18 years old. So obviously we have to make sure that there's a robust marriage law, and we need to look at that in the future on how that is drafted and gone through the legislative process in the future, but it's a tremendous challenge. The other issue that we have to do is girls who marry early also drop out of school. They have children at an early age, and then they're more prone to poverty.
And then it becomes a trap, because then they're producing children who will not have that many
and then it
opportunities
becomes a
in
trap, and there's a whole cycle. And obviously, a large proportion of the women who are poor come from, early marriage or have produced children at an early age, and it is a challenge, and it's a significant burden that unfortunately they'll live with for a long time. And they are a harder to reach population vis-a-vis in rural areas with that much, on the outer islands, on the remote islands, without access to adequate facilities or without access to education. And also, they drop out of school at an earlier age and don't complete their schooling, which remains a tremendous challenge for girls.
No, but Douglas, do you see, Indonesia, we now have a democracy, but so at the same time, which means that we're choosing our leaders from the local leaders. And on the one hand, we're also seeing a sort of a shifting, and it's just not in Indonesia, but around the world, when it comes to increasing sort of conservatism and the desire to sort of keep women in their place. And you mentioned about the inequality. But are we going backwards on some issues, or actually this is just teething problems that Indonesia is actually on the right track when it comes to educating and giving opportunities to them?
Let's hope not. Obviously, on the positive note, we can say that Indonesia has had a woman president, and the United States has not. But there's a lot of work to do. I think it's some teething problems, some emerging problems. There has been tremendous achievement. Indonesia has made achievement in terms of the last 20, 30 years on the health and the education thing. There's a lot needs to be done. I think more concentration on the gender equality is just essential for all of us to be aware of. I think the point is for us to be pushing more and more and more on the awareness side, and making sure that we hold our government officials, our elected officials, more accountable for these kind of quotas, these kind of measures in the future, so that the voting population and the young can evaluate them based upon that kind of indicators. And the SDG does provide guidance and indicators on gender equality, which are very useful for us to hold Indonesia accountable and the whole world accountable for gender equality.
Yes, and we still have issues to discuss ahead of us. Setelah yang berikut ini, kita akan lanjutkan pembahasan mengenai kontribusi Indonesia dalam PBB dan juga peran PBB secara umum di dunia. Insight, Indonesia telah menjadi negara anggota Perserikatan Bangsa-Bangsa itu sejak 28 September tahun 1950, jadi lebih dari 50 tahun ya, hampir 68 tahun. Dan Indonesia tentu saja telah berkontribusi di berbagai bidang, diantaranya menjadi anggota Dewan Ekonomi Sosial dan Dewan Hak Asasi Manusia. Nah, lalu seperti apa kira-kira kontribusi Indonesia untuk PBB dan apa kira-kira peran PBB sekarang di dunia ini? Kita lanjutkan perbincangan bersama Douglas Broderick, Kepala Perwakilan PBB di Indonesia dan juga Kepala Perwakilan untuk UNDP di Indonesia. I mean, the United Nations, it's almost 70 years old now. And Indonesia has been part of it since 1950. So just very quickly, from your experience here, how has the partnership between the Indonesian government and the UN and UNDP been working out? What are the main challenges that you feel? Is everybody in the same page, or are there issues where you feel that it could be improved, particularly now that Indonesia can play a much greater role, being one of the largest democracies in the world and can be a good example of, for example, the largest Muslim nation in the world and moderate and stuff like that, growing economy.
Indonesia has incredible assets, the fourth largest country and democracy, third largest in the world, and the largest Muslim country in the world. So they can bring and have brought tremendous assets in terms of the UN. Indonesia is very interested in peacekeeping, building the peacekeeping to 4,000 troops by 2019. They were very engaged in terms of the sustainable development goals in the future. Indonesia and the UN, for instance, we sit down every year and have a consultative forum with the government in terms of what they want from the UN and what we need from the government. So the relationship has been very good, and I'm very happy that it has improved, and we've had different coordination mechanisms. We've had different engagements, and we have a very honest dialogue. If there's problems, the government knows about it, and we also let the government know about problems also. Obviously, we've had sensitive human rights issues, and we've been able to discuss that.
Which are always going to be there until
Which are always going to be there,
resolved
and we
one
have
way or
the
the
dialogue, the engagement with the government that allows us to have that sort of relationship. And we appreciate that the professionalism and the lack of being too sensitive, which sometimes other governments are, but Indonesia is able to deal with these kind of issues, and we're very happy about that.
Well, what can we do more, especially when it comes to solving some of the world problem at the moment? As we all know, it's with the conflict in the Middle East, with Syria, with the question of refugees, increasing extremism, intolerance, terrorism, and so on and so forth. I mean, how do you see Indonesia's role in that area? And also, what can you see as happening in the UN when it comes to tackling these global issues that's proving a headache for everybody, every country?
Indonesia has had a history of conflict abatement and reducing conflict in the past. There were 13 areas of big conflict. Indonesia has taught other countries how to progress away from conflict, how to move towards a development model, and how to get people out of conflict. And we can look, for instance, at Aceh as an example with the peace accord and peace process. I think it's very important that Indonesia continue to do so and strengthen their role globally, especially ways, for instance, in the Middle East, with the UN and through other regional bodies. I think that the excellent idea of the peacekeeping and increasing and making that strengthened, and obviously Sentul Peacekeeping Center is a model for the UN in terms of a very big center that's able to train professional peacekeepers. I think that going down at the end of the day, obviously we want to see continued Indonesian leadership at all levels, including up to the president on issues, especially issues around Syria. unfortunately, I think all of us are. Syria is in its 7th year as a crisis. Unfortunately, I hate to say this, that we're not even at the beginning of a resolution of the Syrian conflict.
There's also Yemen with...
And there's also Yemen. And we may have to live with these conflicts for a long term, a long time. When I was on the Thai-Cambodian border, which was basically a simple, let's say, post-Cold War or Cold War conflict, that was 14 years that the people were on the border and that conflict lasted. In Syria, we're 7 years in a middle-income country. A big, big challenge with those people in terms of outflow and the fighting forces, and the conflict gets layer-caked and layer-caked and more
it's affecting
complex.
other countries.
And affecting more countries. And there is a part for Indonesia. I know Indonesia is very aware of this. They have done work on preventing violent extremism. There has been work in terms of reducing conflict, combining development and in conflict areas. So Indonesia is able to share those lessons and get that out. And that's something that Indonesia can do, but basically keep their leadership focus at the UN, which would be something that all of us would want to work on together.
And we have to be much more proactive, much more communicative, and much more sort of out there when it comes to, bringing our presence on the global stage. Which brings me to the UN itself now, with the new leadership, with the new Secretary General, and also the increasing sort of uncertainties that we see in the global situation. We see in the United States, for example, a country that doesn't really respect sort of global relationship, and then we see increasing dictatorship in various parts of the world, such as, for example, Turkey, and also the protectionist tendencies that we see growing. How do you, now that you are leaving Indonesia and maybe have a much bigger perspective on what's happening in the world, how do you see the UN will carry on forward, particularly when things like funding towards some of the bodies, such as the UNDP and the World Food Programme, is lessening as more countries, particularly United States, not interested in contributing?
I do have several concerns on that. Obviously, Syria is taking over a large portion operationally and money-wise of many of the UN agencies. That's going to remain a challenge. And basically, that money is affecting other operations which have less money to operate on. I also see at the end of the day, the challenge and opportunity that the UN has is the UN is going to have to depend in the future on more domestic resources, domestic financing. So obviously, we would have to work with civil society, private sector, and government partners in terms of finding ways to help finance UN programs, projects, and activities for the betterment of countries, including in Indonesia. It's something that we've been working on. You might call it co-financing, contributions, sharing of costs. But
crowdfunding, whatever. Even
crowdsource funding, different social media funding. But it's going to be something, especially with Indonesia being a middle-income country, and this part of the world, the East Asia, having such incredible economic progress, like Indonesia going from $1 to $2 trillion economy, within the next 10 years, and traditional donors having left more and leaving, these countries, including Indonesia, where domestic resourcing and government financing needs to take over and help us with technical assistance and services to help the people better achieve the 17 Sustainable Development Goals in the future.
But you are optimistic about the state of the world. This United Nations, that was actually, it's a relatively new construct when it comes to our human history, right? I mean, this is something that we never had before.
Well, I'm optimistic because you have to remember the UN and Indonesia were founded in the same year, 1945. So I'm very optimistic about Indonesia, and I'm very optimistic about the future of the UN. And the other thing that happens is the UN we've evolved through many different administrations in the US, in terms of Europe. We've gone through this kind of, downturn, turbulence, or noise about funding and everything else. And we actually have survived, and in some cases even prospered better, and learned from those lessons to build better foundations, be more efficient, be more cost effective, and deliver better products to the people. So it's something that, it's a cycle. We saw it in the 1980s, we saw it in the beginning of 2000, and we see it now. We survive with it, we make ourselves the best value as possible for governments, and we deliver the best products that we can for people to improve their lives, especially the lives of, the bottom 1 billion of the world who are most vulnerable, who we want to serve.
Okay, well, Douglas, thank you so much for sharing your insight, and we're going to miss you in Indonesia, and good luck with your new ventures.
Thank you. Well, I left in Indonesia in 1982, and in 2017 I left Indonesia, but I have always returned. So I will return, and thank you very much for the time and opportunity. And I look forward always to be an ambassador for, through, and with Indonesia. Terima kasih banyak.
Sama-sama, and we look forward to seeing you here again in Indonesia.
Thank you, Desi.
Indonesia merupakan salah satu dari 193 negara anggota PBB yang berkomitmen penuh menjalankan agenda pembangunan global, mengembangkan hubungan persahabatan antar negara, serta memelihara perdamaian dan keamanan internasional. Dan salah satu agenda global yang dicanangkan oleh PBB adalah Tujuan Pembangunan Berkelanjutan Sustainable Development Goals yang harus dicapai pada tahun 2030. Di antaranya pengentasan rakyat dari kemiskinan dan kelaparan, peningkatan kesehatan dan kesetaraan gender. Untuk mencapai tujuan ini, pemerintah Indonesia mengintegrasikan tujuan SDGs ke dalam agenda pembangunan nasional dan juga daerah. Selain dukungan PBB, pencapaian SDGs juga membutuhkan partisipasi aktif dari masyarakat sebagai target dan juga pelaku pembangunan. Demikian My Insight malam ini. Jangan lupa saksikan kembali Insight besok bersama saya Desi Anwar. Sampai jumpa dan bye-bye.